going to go to the next one, which is Uparamaha Kaha. What is Uparama or Uparati? Now, a very interesting definition is given in this particular, for this particular qualification or accomplishment. In reply to the question, Uparamaha Kaha, or what is Uparama? Swadharma Anushtanameva is the reply, which means strict observance of one's own duty, one's own Swadharma. Anushtana means to observe, to practice, and to firmly establish oneself in that. So this is what is the definition or the meaning given for the word Uparama. Uparatihi or Uparama literally means to withdraw all the senses from their natural tendencies. The natural tendency of the sense organs is a movement outward. Now, Uparati is actually literally a withdrawal of the senses. But why is it that in this particular case, the answer given is the strict observance of one's own duty? It's a very strange way of putting it. Because in the Viveka Chudamani, there is another definition where he talks about withdrawal. I'll share another screen in which we can see that. He says, Bahya analambanam vrutter esha uparatir uttama. The meaning of this is the highest or best form of self-withdrawal or uparati is that condition of mind function ceasing to be affected by influences or being supported by external objects. This is the explanation given in the Viveka Chudamani by Adi Shankara himself. Whereas in the Tattva Bodha, he says it is Swadharma Anushtana as the meaning or explanation of the term Uparati. Now, why is this particular term Swadharma is used in this explanation? That is what we need to explore. See, when he is talking about Swadharma, he is talking about one's own innate nature and one's own inner self. He is not identifying with the external senses and sense objects and the organs of senses and the action. He is here trying to say that you follow your innate duty or what your inner self dictates. What is it that your inner self is dictating to you? Strictly observing that is Uparati. Now, earlier we have seen that the early two qualifications, the first two qualifications are one of exercising control on the mind through understanding of the nature of the mind. Control does not mean suppression or repression or keeping it down with force. One has to understand the nature of the mind and bring it into subjugation, not by force, but by understanding the nature of its functioning. It operates in a certain field. And that does not represent our true self. Though our normal mental consciousness is at that level, mental level, it is not our true self. The true self is something else, which is beyond the body and the mind. So that self has to be recognized, and one has to follow the dictates of that inner self. That is Swadharma. In this sense, the serious search for truth, T with a capital letter, or what we call as the ultimate reality, is the dharma of everybody. The duty or obligation or natural tendency should be self-discovery, discovering who one is. So therefore, Uparati is an opportunity or a qualification which one has to come to by understanding what is my natural direction. The natural direction is actually inward, but because of our nature, because the way we live our life, we have made it external, because our only way of life is based on our mental perceptions and mental activity. So that's the only functioning, and therefore it appears as though that the whole nature of man is outward driven, but that's not true. The natural tendency is inwards for the higher principle of life and higher principle of the self. If we can use the two terms called as Dehatma and Jivatma, the Dehatma is concerned with the physical, the astral, and the lower mental. The natural direction of these three, the Dehatma, which constitutes the Dehatma, is downward or outward. Whereas the higher principle of the mind and the Buddhi and the Atma, or Atma Buddhi Manas, which is called as the Jivatma, the natural direction of the Jivatma is upwards or inwards in a way. So you see, therefore, the natural tendency is to follow the dictates of our own inner self, Antaratma. There is a term called Antaratma, or they call it as sometimes Pratyagatma also. This Antaratma or this Pratyagatma is the inner self. Observing that, what exactly is the inner self, when you have a reasonable state of calm mind, when your mind is in a state of quietude, there is that possibility of coming in touch with a level of consciousness which reveals our own true self. And that true self gives you certain directions. Sometimes in the English language, it is the term conscience is used. Conscience is something inside us which always keeps us telling what is the right thing and what is the right attitude one need to have. But our mind dominates the conscience and makes it dull and blunt. And after a certain number of years, all of us become outward oriented, and the conscience does not prick us anymore. The conscience doesn't act at all. This is one important thing. So if one becomes sensitive, even for a child also knows what is right, what is wrong. There is that innate sense of right and wrong. So that we have to understand, and that is what is meant by self-withdrawal or uparati. Uparati precisely refers to that withdrawal from the external senses and sense objects and following the dictates of one's own inner self, which is unerring, which does not need any validation from outside about its correctness or rightness. It by its own nature, it is always on the right path. So you have to understand why this Swadharma is used here. And this is what the Bhagavad Gita also keeps on telling. Swadharme nidhanam shreyah paradharmo bhayava. One needs to understand one's own true nature, one's own tendencies. Sometimes if our tendencies are outward flowing or disturbed, or they are not in accordance with the kind of life we want to lead, there will be conflict. Now this conflict can be resolved not by the mind, but by the inner self only. And you have to understand these two terms, Swabhava and Swadharma. Swabhava is the innate nature with which we are born, which is an accumulation of our vasanas and samskaras and all the acquired knowledge and skill, the repository. That means the essence of that which is conveyed from one life to another life is the Swabhava. I have another slide to show, which I prepared in connection with the Bhagavad Gita Bhashya, where I want you to understand, where I want you to understand what is Swadharma, what is Swabhava, and what is Swadharma. I'll read out this. This is what I have prepared based on my understanding. Are you able to see this slide? Yes? Okay, thank you. Swabhava is one's innate nature, endowments, qualities, latent talents, propensities, predilections, the core of one's individualized being evolved over many lives. When we say latent talents and qualities and endowments and propensities and predilections and all that, it means both the good and bad part of it, the strengths and weaknesses. All these things are included in this Swabhava, and this is one's individualized being which has evolved over many lives. So this is the Swabhava which we bring with us right at the time of birth. Right at the time of birth, this is what we bring with us. Now, what is Swadharma? Swadharma is related to and defined by the station or situation in life and limited by the external environment for expression. The field for the manifestation of one's Swabhava within the limitations imposed by the law of karma. This is Swadharma. You can say that Swadharma is the environment into which one is born because of karma and because of the relationship with the people and the environment and the location around, which is the field of operation for a particular person. So you are born at a certain time, at a certain place, to certain parents. So you have a localized environment for you. You come into a particular community, you come into a particular caste, you come into a particular religion, you have siblings, you have association with that place. All this is an external setting that is made for the Swabhava to operate within the limitations imposed by karma. So, Swabhava and Swadharma, what happens is, in most of the cases, it gets mixed up. You can't really separate as a Swabhava and Swadharma completely and isolate them. Because of the innate nature and the qualities you have acquired over a long period of time, over many lives, you are also creating the environment required for that. So Swabhava and Swadharma are very intimately connected. But what happens, the problem comes when your nature, your innate nature and the environment which is there are at loggerheads. The Swabhava and Swadharma have to be matched for deriving optimal advantage and benefits in our present life for our spiritual unfoldment. You have to remember this aspect. You have to match it so that the spiritual unfoldment is progressing and then evolving. Otherwise, we should not look at it purely from a mundane point of view and to try to match Swabhava and Swadharma. You see, for example, I'll give you a very typical example will be that of Hiranyakashipu and Prahlada. Hiranyakashipu is a demon king, is a Rakshasa Raja. His son Prahlada has none of the demonic qualities in him. And he is a Vishnu Bhakta. Whereas Hiranyakashipu is a Vishnu Dveshi. That means he hates, he has developed tremendous amount of hatred towards Vishnu. Now, you see the combination. However much Hiranyakashipu wanted to influence Prahlada, he was not influenced by him, by his father, because of his Swabhava. But it always brought Prahlada into conflict with his father because of the environment. He was born into that place at that time to those parents because he had a dharma to fulfill. Because his Swabhava was pure and it was of the sattvic nature, nothing pertaining to the asuri or the demonic nature could attach to him. On the other hand, finally he transforms his father also and gives him a kind of liberation from this bondage of the Rakshasa Swabhava and Rakshasa Swadharma. Literally, he had to be killed in the sense, it is not the physical killing of Hiranyakashipu that is more important. It was the demonic nature of Hiranyakashipu that had to be destroyed. And that was the dharma of Prahlada also. He had to lead him to Vishnu, and Vishnu had to take an avatar of Nrsimha. All this allegorical story is to impress upon us that if your Swabhava is pure, if your Swabhava is sattvic, whatever be the situation or station in life, you remain unaffected by it, and you will follow your own Swadharma, that is to bring about a transformation in the field of your operation. So anything that militates or rebels or revolts against one Swabhava and Swadharma is Paradharma. If my Swabhava and Swadharma do not match, then it is not my Swadharma, it is Paradharma, it is somebody else's Dharma. It is no longer my Dharma. And what happens when you adopt Paradharma? it retards all progress, both worldly and spiritual. Because you are always in conflict. So one has to find a proper match or a proper understanding of one's swabhava and swadharma and match it in such a way that it is going to help you to the maximum extent possible for spiritual unfoldment. Don't look at it from a worldly success point of view. But unfortunately, what happens is we are mostly stuck in this worldly aspect because that appears to be as our swadharma. But precisely because we are talking about spiritual evolution, and as a preparatory aspect of that spiritual evolution, there is this mention of these 6 qualifications. Here the meaning or the explanation is very clearly given. Please understand what is your duty, for what purpose you have taken birth. And in accordance with that purpose of your life, what is your duty? And a strict observation of that duty is uparati. That means if you are oriented spiritually, nothing which is worldly is of any attraction to you any longer. That is true uparati. Not simply shutting ourselves in a room or not exposing ourselves to the objects of the senses. That is only physical withdrawal. Physically withdrawing from an environment which is not suitable to you, that is anyway required. But if your mind keeps on dwelling on the sense objects, even with your eyes closed and with all your senses closed, you can go on thinking of sense objects. You can go on thinking of fulfillment of your desires. So that won't help. That's not going to help at all. So you have to understand the nature, the purpose of life, the meaning of life, and then turn inwards to understand that, and that becomes one's duty. And that duty has to be strictly observed. There is no leeway for us. There is no leeway. Whenever it is convenient, I will observe it, sir, and whenever it is inconvenient, I will just keep it aside. No, that won't help. That's not going to help you at all. Because it doesn't serve that kind of purpose. So you have to understand very clearly what is uparati. Uparati is not a forcible withdrawal. It is not a forcible withdrawal. You are totally independent. There is no alambana, bahyalambana. The term used by Adi Shankaracharya in his Viveka Chudamani for uparati is to completely become independent of all external objects and all external things, and completely be independent of that support. This has that means that is why in the further when it comes to the other aspects of spiritual practices, they say that you should be prepared to sleep wherever possible. Wherever you are there, you should be able to take rest. You should be able to go with have food, whatever kind of food is available, you can have, and you may go without food also if food is not available. That is the ultimate. That is why he calls it uttama. Uparati uttama. The highest state is to become totally independent of all external support. That is we have to work out to reach that state where you are not dependent on anything. If something is available, you use it. If something is not available, you are not bothered, you are not disturbed. That is what is the meaning of uparati, and which is swadharma anusthana. This is very profound. See, while the answers are very short and sweet, one needs to contemplate at a much deeper level to understand why this particular definition or explanation is given to us. It's very, very difficult to know what is one's duty in the first place. What is one's swadharma is a great confusion for everybody, and that's how we have created conflicts in our life. So clearly they say, what is your duty? What is your primary goal, primary objective, purpose or meaning for life? Is to turn inward and recognize the presence of that self, that inner self. Recognizing its purpose is the swadharma. So you are now, when you are withdrawing, the withdrawal is no longer forcible. You are automatically becoming independent. Atmanyevatmana tushtaha. What is the quality of a sthita prajna? The Bhagavad Gita self, the self satisfied in the self content in the self. Content in the self in the sense, no external dependence on anything for anybody, or anything in any matter, at any time. So this is the profundity of this statement of Swadharma Anushtana. Then we will go to the next one, Titiksha. Titiksha ka. Shitoshna sukha dukha adi sahishnutvam. What is Titiksha? The endurance of heat and cold, pleasure and pain, etc. In the traditional ancient Indian scriptures and the Sanatana Dharma, they have recognized this duality of things, the pairs of opposites, as they say. These pairs of opposites are the things which have been very early, they have recognized that these are the things which play havoc. The pairs of opposites, heat and cold, pleasure and pain. There are so many other these pairs of opposites, good and evil, high and low. You can have any number of these pairs of opposites, because the mind is always comparative. It can only understand things in comparison. It cannot understand things if there is nothing to compare. Black and white, heat and cold, pleasure and pain, high and low, as I said. All these pairs of opposites are the main cause for conflict. Now you have to understand one important thing. The pairs of opposites by themselves have nothing to do with anything. It is the mind which goes into selection of these things depending on several factors. For example, this has to be understood very carefully. For example, when it is very hot, what do you prefer? You prefer cold. You prefer an air conditioner. You prefer cold water or a cold drink or a cold juice or cold food. Suppose it is winter, then you want warm clothes, warm environment, warm food. The cold remains as cold and what remains as hot remains as hot. There is no problem in that. The problem comes because depending on the circumstances, depending on your mental condition, depending on the external factors to which you are oriented, your preferences keep changing. Similarly with pleasure and pain. See, if my son is good to me and he listens to whatever I say, is very obedient, it gives me pleasure. If he doesn't, if he is disobedient and he doesn't listen to me, and he behaves in a manner which is not conducive to me, then the same fellow, the same son causes pain. Now, is it in the son or is it in me? The problem, is it my son or is it me? It is me because I want him to be obedient. I want him to be very good to me. I want him to behave in a certain manner with me. And I want a certain kind of, I have a certain kind of expectation. And if it is in accordance with that, it is pleasurable to me. And if it is not in accordance with me, it becomes painful. So every relationship has got this problem, whether it is the spouse or a sibling or a child or one's own children or whatever it is, or one's friends or boss, or you can extend it to the whole of humanity. The problem is not with that, the person is like that. See, I am what I am. Now, in my relationship, you have a problem with me. You have a problem with me not because of me, but because of yourself, because you are expecting something from me. You see the problem now? Normally, when we talk about these pairs of opposites, we assume that because these are pairs of opposites, they are creating problem for us. No, they're actually not pairs of opposites. We have the nomenclature used is that because in one of in the commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, Adi Shankara very clearly says, cold things are cold and hot things are hot. That is their nature. You can't change them. You can't make ice hot. You can't make fire cold. The nature of ice is, it is cold. The nature of fire is, it is hot. But in summer season, you prefer ice. You don't mind putting it on your head also. And in winter season, you don't mind putting your hands almost into the fire to get warmth, especially if you are in a high altitude place and a very cold place. And if it is winter, the heat gives you a lot of pleasure. So these pairs of opposites are basically what they affect me, their qualities remaining what they are. Endurance of that. That means you don't mind whether it is cold or hot. Every situation, you should be able to accept it without much of a disturbance. Don't get too much disturbed. It's very hot, hot and hot. It's terribly hot, and what should I do? Where should I go? Rush and all that. That's a mental disturbance. Similarly, when it's very cold, don't get into a mental mode of getting disturbed by these things. Endurance is basically not to get disturbed. Endurance means not to get disturbed. If something gives you pleasure, enjoy it for the time being. If something gives you pain, avoid it for the time being without being disturbed in the mind. The endurance, when he says about titiksha, you don't mean, see, they have taken it to extremes. See, some of these foolish practices of sitting on ice just to get endurance, or sitting very close to fire. We have this Panchagni karma. There are 5 fires around you and you sit in the center of it to develop endurance of heat. No, that's foolish. Because after all, you have a body and the body has its own sensations. And if you have too much of heat, the body feels inconvenient. It's not putting yourself into that inconvenience to develop endurance. It's changing one's mental attitude towards things. If it's hot, without getting disturbed, move to a cooler place, move to a better place, and continue your work. If it is too cold, go to a place which is reasonably warm and pleasant for you to carry on your work. The work is more important. The spiritual activity is more important, which requires equanimity of mind. Equanimity of mind means you should be able to endure certain things without getting disturbed. This inner meaning is what we have to catch. not forcibly going and sitting on ice or in the Himalayas and developing some yogic powers and all that, because they are of no consequence. See, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra very clearly says that all siddhis will take you away from the spiritual path. All these things are available in nature. See, there is an interesting story of Adi Shankara, which is attributed to Adi Shankara. It seems some great yogi accosted Adi Shankara when he was going on his journey, and he said, "Do you have the siddhis which I have?" Then Adi Shankara says, "What siddhi do you have?" He says, "I have practiced for 40 years and I can levitate myself in the air and then go into the sky. They have like a bird and then come back," and he demonstrates it to him. He simply flies into the air and then after a few rounds in the sky, he lands before him and asks Adi Shankara, "Do you have this power?" Adi Shankara says, "I don't have that power, but why did you waste 40 years of your life?" That fellow says, "Why? What do you mean wasting 40 years of life?" Yes. If you had cursed some noble person, you would have been born like a crow in your next life, and throughout your life you could have traveled all over the place in the air. By simply abusing some good noble person, you could have got this capability of going in the air and flying in the sky. The meaning of this story is that these siddhis are of no account. These siddhis are of no consequence at all. They create arrogance in us that I have achieved this great siddhi. I can sit on ice for 10 hours. I can bury myself up to the head in mud and live there for 1 year. All these things are of no consequence from the spiritual point. It is the mind which is the most important instrument which has to be understood and which has to be brought into one's own control, in the sense by understanding the nature. Control not through suppression and putting it down. When you understand the nature of it, it will automatically come into your control. So that is titiksha. Titiksha is endurance, means to be unruffled, to be undisturbed. Your purpose, you don't deviate from your purpose. Whatever be the external circumstances, whatever be the external situation that is created for you. That is titiksha. I hope these two are very clearly understood from a deeper point of view for an aspirant. For a true aspirant, one has to understand this in the right context and not cause unnecessary pain and difficulty for the physical organism, for the physical body. Shariramadhyam khalu dharma sadhanam. For any dharma sadhana, for any for practice of dharma, the body is primary. The body is primary. Even in yogasanas and all, that's what they teach. When you start learning, if there is any pain, any discomfort, they say, please stop it. Don't allow the body to get into a situation of discomfort or pain. So progressively, slowly, you have to train the body so that you are able to practice the asanas comfortably without pain and discomfort. So all these things have to be correlated with each other, and therefore you have to understand in the right context. That is Uparati and Titiksha. Then we will move on to the next one, Shraddha. See, we have to see some primary definitions. The definitions given here are very primary. This, as I said, Tattva Bodha is a preliminary text where the answers or explanations are given in very short sentences, so that it is easy for the person to remember, to contemplate, and to meditate upon it. Now, Shraddha Kidrushi. What is the nature of Shraddha? Guru Vedanta Vakyadishu Vishwasaha Shraddha. Faith in the words of the Guru and in the statements made in the scriptures is Shraddha. Guru and Vedanta Vakya. Faith in the words of the Guru and in the scriptures is Shraddha. Now, again there will be a conflict. Who is a Guru? We have to come to some very basic things. Who is a Guru? Now, a Guru is not a person. This is what we have to remember very, very clearly. A Guru is not a person. A Guru is a state of consciousness. And a being in that state of consciousness is termed as a Guru. A being who is in a state of consciousness where he is firmly established in his own self, such a person is a Guru. Not all and sundry. Whoever sports a long beard or whoever wears ochre robes, whoever gives you some basic knowledge about things, whoever gives you some bookish knowledge of things, he can't be a Guru. Basically, your own inner self is your Guru. And that symbol is symbolized by, very beautifully, that is symbolized by Dakshinamurti. Dakshinamurti is a symbol. It is a symbol of the ultimate Guru. Please understand that he is not a person. It is a state of consciousness. It's a high state of consciousness which is natural to that person. And he may be having a physical body, that's a different matter. But the Guru, when it is symbolized by Dakshinamurti, Murti means a personification. Dakshina, one of the meanings of Dakshina is right. We call the right hand as the Dakshina Hasta. We call the left hand as the Vama Hasta. We talk about the right way as the Dakshina Marga. The wrong or the left path is called as the Vama Marga. Dakshinamurti, if you take it as a symbol of what is eternally right, what is eternally right, it is that personification of that is Dakshinamurti. Now we do this circumambulation in the temples. They call it as Pradakshina. Pradakshina is you take a clockwise, you move in a clockwise direction. Have you noticed that at every point you are turning to the right? Have you noticed that at every point of this circumambulation, if you look at it as a circle, at every point you are turning to the right. At every point you are turning to the right. What does it mean? That I should keep my body, my mind, my emotions, my feelings, my thoughts, everything in the right direction. In the temple, whatever idol is there is again a symbol and a source of energy. So you are drawing that source of energy by moving around it and moving in the right direction, whereby you are invoking the presence of the deity or the idol to help you to be always right in your life. There is actually another technical angle, one of the scientists, when we were discussing this matter, he was telling me that in an electromagnetic field, if you move in the clockward direction, the flow of the energy is upwards. The flow of energy for the deity and the flow of energy that influences you is upward. In any coil, to which you give, you have these magnetic coils, you know, the motor principle. The motor principle or the dynamo principle operates on this electromagnetic movement. And when you go about it, the field of the electromagnetic field, if it is moving in the clockwise direction, the flow of energy is upwards. That's also another technical reason for moving in the clockwise direction or doing a pradakshina. So, your own inner self is a guru. Everybody else who helps you on the path of spirituality is a guide to you. Is only a guide. He is like a pointer. He is like a pointer pointing out the direction in which you have to move. But the movement has to be yours. You have to travel. You have to traverse. You have to go through the whole process. That is the basic meaning of an external guide. At a primary school teacher is important at that level. A middle school or high school teacher is important at that level. Now, when you have learned what the primary school teacher has to teach you, you don't hold on to his legs and sit there only, isn't it, in the primary school? Sir, you taught me ABCD and 1, 2, 3, and therefore you are the best guru in this world, and therefore I'll hold on to your feet. I'll not allow you to go anywhere, and neither will I go anywhere. I will remain, both of us, let us remain at the primary school level only. We don't say that. He's a guide at a particular place. You thank him. You be respectful to him. You have gratitude towards him. But don't make him a great thing as though that he is everything for you and therefore you need not go anywhere, because that itself has a great limitation. So as you move in life, as you progress in evolution, different people, different situations, different things come to teach you lessons. You know, Bruhaspati is called Guru. Bruhaspati is called as the Guru of the Devatas because he knows the ultimate principle. That's why he's called as Bruhaspati. Bruhat means the Brahman, the great. And he is the Lord of that. His energy signifies that, and therefore he is called as Guru. And Shukra is Venus. Shukracharya is called as the Guru of the Rakshasas, Asuras. Why? Venus represents the force of desire. Venus represents the force of desire. And that is the important thing for the Asuras. So you have a Shukracharya for him. You see, depending upon your nature, you will get that kind of Guru. Finally, what happens? When you have gone through this path, a point will come where the Guru or whomsoever in whom you have put your faith will tell you, beyond this, I'll be of no use to you. You have to go on your own. You have to go on your own. Unless you know the Paratattva, unless you know, you have at least a mental clarity about that ultimate reality, where total independence is required. Like what we have discussed in Uparati, where total independence from all external things are required. Here also, total independence is required from all external supports for your spiritual progress. That's why Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti used to very clearly say that the Guru destroys the disciple and the disciple destroys the Guru. Because you are holding on to a person. We are all fond of holding on to persons because we cannot hold on to his consciousness. We cannot rise to his consciousness. We want to do piggybacking. Somebody says, I have risen to a certain level of consciousness, which I don't want. I'm a lazy fellow. I don't want to practice anything and I don't want to do anything. I'll climb onto that guru and say, okay, I'll sit on your shoulders and you carry me. And if he is a false guru, he'll be more than happy to carry you, because he'll not only be carrying you, but he'll be carrying 1 million disciples. Because he depends on the disciples. His own importance is because of what the disciples give him. Left to himself, what is he? He has no importance. So when you are talking about faith or Shraddha, Shraddha also means seriousness. It not only means faith, it also means seriousness. You have to examine the words of the Guru seriously. You have to examine the words of the scripture seriously. You have to question them. You have to go deep into it. You have to understand the nature of these questions. You are not bothered about anybody. Adi Shankara himself says that if the Vedas say that ice is hot, then say that Vedas are wrong. Because your common sense tells you that ice cannot be hot. So if the Vedas make a wrong statement, which is not in accordance with your own personal experience and with common sense, then you reject the Vedas also. The scriptures are also guidance only. The scriptures are also meant for guidance. The Upanishad itself says, Dve vidya veditavye. You have to know 2 vidyas. Paracha aparachaiva. You need to know the para vidya, or the transcendental vidya. And you have to know the apara vidya, or the worldly vidya. And you know what the Upanishad says? All the Vedas, Vedangas, everything is worldly wisdom only. It is all pertaining to apara vidya. So where can you think in terms of putting all your faith, blind faith in the words of the scriptures? You can't put blind faith in the words of the scriptures. If the scripture is wrong, you should be able to say it, you are wrong. The scripture is not sacrosanct by itself. You are making it sacrosanct because of your blind belief. See, when I was studying the Bhagavad Gita Bhashya, I felt I had a lot of doubts and I did not agree. My mind did not agree with what Adi Shankara was saying. That does not mean that my respect and regard for Adi Shankara has diminished. I am only saying that I am unable to understand or appreciate what he is saying. Maybe after further reading I may appreciate him, or finally I may discard Adi Shankaracharya and come to my own reasoning. Nobody is preventing me. And that in no way diminishes one's respect and regard. For example, there are several parents who are uneducated, but their children are highly educated. Does it mean that the child should disregard his parents because of their ignorance or being uneducated? No. There should be Shraddha. There should be that regard. There should be that reverence. There should be that devotion. There should be that faith in those parents, because they have given birth to you. But don't have blind faith. This has to be very clearly understood. Otherwise, faith in the words of Guru, whatever the Guru says, I have full faith, sir. Whatever the scripture says, I have full faith, sir. Then you are not exercising your mind. One is not exercising one's own common sense and reason. So we have to go deep into these things. There may be several people who may not agree with what I am saying, because they have been taught or they're bound by tradition, thinking that all and sundry can be gurus and everything the scripture says is true. See, we have a great problem. See, there are 108 Upanishads. The names of these Upanishads are there in one Upanishad called as the Muktiko Upanishad. And after this, they have found that they have discovered many more, and they say there are now 250 Upanishads. All Upanishads are not original. They were created by so many people of a much lower caliber. That's the reason why Adi Shankara restricted himself to the 10 or 11 Upanishads and he did not talk about any of the other Upanishads at all. Because they are irrelevant. Irrelevant in the sense, if you are able to understand these 10 or 11, the major Upanishads, that's more than enough. You need not go on reading scriptures and say that Upanishad says like this Upanishad says like this. That's only for scholastic discussions and arguments. You have to show, in order to show your scholarship, they may be useful. So blind faith in the words of the so-called physical guru whom you see in a particular form, or a scripture which you have not understood properly or which has been misunderstood or misrepresented, we need not have faith in that. Shraddha is that seriousness to examine things, examine everything, question everything. Don't rest till you understand it in the right perspective. And as you are serious, many doors, many windows, many opportunities open up to give you that true knowledge, true wisdom, and the ultimate reality. Then you will come across what is called as the Paramaguru. The Paramaguru is nobody else other than your own inner ruler immortal. The Upanishads very clearly say that the Atman and the Brahman are one and the same. Qualitatively, limitation has come about on the Atman, but essentially it is no different from the Brahman. The Atman and Brahman are in essence one and the same. So you have to recognize the Atman, you are the inner self in you to be the Brahman, and then that Brahman, that Atman becomes your true Paramaguru, and you will realize that Brahman. That's all. One need not go anywhere beyond that. That is the meaning of the statement of Shraddha. The Shraddha has to be understood at a much deeper level. Then we'll come to the last one, which is Samadhanam. He says, Samadhanam kim? Chittaikagrata. What is Samadhana? Chitta ekagrata. One-pointedness of the Chitta. Chitta, unfortunately, we have no better word to translate. We translate it as mind. There are some translators, some writers who have given the name called mind stuff. And there are other commentaries where they have written elaborately on this meaning of Chitta. Chitta is the medium of consciousness in which the mind functions. Mind is a Western term. Manas is the Indian term. The term in our scriptures is Manas. And Manas, we have seen, is Sankalpa and Vikalpa. It only operates in discursive thinking and analytical thinking, and it is always in the process of exploring things which are unknown to it, and therefore doubt becomes an important aspect of the mind. Mind is not Chitta. Chitta is much larger and much comprehensive. Chitta is called as the medium through which consciousness functions at different levels of manifestation. Mind, from a Western psychology point of view, is concerned about only three things. Western psychology defines as mind to be concerned with thought, feeling, and volition. Thought, feeling, and volition. This is the mind for the from the Western psychology point of view. Thought, feeling, and volition. Your ability to do something. Your mind dictates your hands and feet, isn't it? Your organs are controlled by the mind. The mind says, move the hand, it will move. The nervous system comes into play and it moves the hand. That is volition. So, for a very limited purpose, the mind is defined by the Western psychologists. And in fact, now they have come across another problem. They are unable to truly find out what exactly is the mind, and they are confining themselves to the brain. They say there are centers in the brain which are concerned with thought, feeling, and volition. They really truly do not understand what the mind is. Several millions of dollars were spent on some projects trying to precisely pinpoint what the mind is, but ultimately they came to the conclusion that we cannot pinpoint what exactly the mind is, but we can take it for granted that there is something called as the mind. That is the present day conclusion of the Western psychologists. So, Chitta cannot be really translated as the mind. Chitta is the aspect of Chit. Chit is the triplicity, Sat, Chit and Ananda, which come into manifestation along with the whole manifestation. These are the three aspects of manifestation: existence, consciousness, and bliss. These are the three main aspects. We will not go into that discussion. But Chitta is a derivative of Chit, the aspect of universal consciousness, the aspect of pure consciousness, which is Chit. Chitta is a derivative of the universal consciousness called as Chit, and this Chitta includes all your things connected with the mind. Because in English we have these terms called as brain, mind, intellect, intelligence, intuition, and all these things. There are so many words are used. We need not go into them because they have to be precisely defined if we need to understand them. We are not interested in the English definitions of it. We are interested in the text which is in the original language. So this Chitta, as I said, is a comprehensive aspect as a medium for the expression of mind, and it is related to that universal consciousness. So every mind or every Chitta may appear as an individualized mental consciousness. I am forced to use these terms mind and mental, but it is a much more comprehensive thing. And that Chitta is connected to the universal mind. So our individual minds are all connected in one way to the universal mind. And in that respect, there is nothing like an individual mind. There is nothing like your mind and my mind. All mind is universal in nature because it is connected to it, because at the ground level, at the base level, my feeling or my thoughts and my desires may be different. Somebody else's thoughts and feelings may be different. But primarily, the nature of desires and desire itself is a common ground for everybody. Feeling itself is a common ground for all humanity. The variety may be in the type of desire, the nature of desire, or the intensity of desire at a particular moment. But everything is common to us. So that is why there is nothing like my mind. You are connected to that universal mind, and for a functional purpose, it has been individualized, or it has assumed a particular appearance for functional purpose only, for the functional purpose. Now that is the principle we have to hold on and make it one-pointed. One-pointed means not concentration on something, not exclusion of everything, but your whole consciousness is occupied by that. What did we say when we said about Uparati? The inward direction, when you move in, you will know your Swadharma, you will know your duty. Your duty is to know the true purpose, meaning, and source of life, source of your being. Now your entire consciousness should be occupied by nothing else other than knowing the truth. Nothing is of any consequence to you now. You have nothing to think about. You are not eliminating. You are not excluding. You are not forcibly throwing out something. I want to be one-pointed. I want to be focused. I want to no, because there is no point as such. Single-pointedness or one-pointedness or focus only means that nothing else is of any interest to you and me. If we are on the spiritual path, nothing else is of any consequence to me except knowing myself. Only one question should occupy the entire consciousness. As Ramana Maharshi says, Nan yar, who am I, who am I, who am I, who am I? My whole consciousness is pervaded by that. Then it becomes one-pointed or single-pointed. My whole consciousness says, who am I? Not in order to find an answer. Please mind, you have to understand this question of Ramana Maharshi also very carefully. When you say, who am I? You are not trying to find an answer for that question. What you are trying to find out is the dissolution of the question. When you come to the right level of consciousness and understanding, the question gets dissolved. You don't need to get an answer, because getting an answer is an activity of the mind. The mind is the culprit which looks for answers, which looks for solutions, which looks for avenues for escape. But if your whole being is pervaded, your whole consciousness is pervaded by only one question, who am I? Then that seriousness, that intensity, that whole pervasion of that dissolves this I. Because this I, we have seen earlier, is only a creation of the mind through its experiences, knowledge and memory. So this I has to be totally dissolved. You need not forcibly dissolve, because that is again an activity of the mind. The dissolution comes about when your whole consciousness is pervaded by the seriousness of trying to understand, trying to realize the true nature of oneself. Unfortunately, because we have to use words, there are so many words to be used, but try to please understand the intention, the intent, the seriousness and the meaning I want to convey, which is behind these words. That is samadhana. So samadhana means bringing everything together. That means all your faculties, all your energy, all your everything that you have at your disposal is brought together, which is nothing but your consciousness. What is me? The me or the I is a bundle of these thoughts, bundle of feelings, bundle of emotions, bundle of experiences, bundle of memories. You have to unbundle them. You have to break the bond, break the tie, the rope that is tying this. The I is tying these things together and calling it as I. When you unbundle it and scatter this whole thing, there is no I any longer. For that, one needs tremendous amount of energy, tremendous amount of seriousness. Unless one has the tremendous amount of seriousness in knowing oneself, no purpose will be served. Spiritual pursuit, if I may call it as pursuit, this is not a right word, cannot be a pastime, cannot be a 1.5 hour or 2 hour session on Sundays or Fridays or Saturdays or weekends. We have to know this. It is our life. It has to be fully integrated with our life. Nothing else should matter. Nothing else should be of any consequence to us. Then you are bringing all the energy, all that passion, all the Tivra Samvega. In the Yoga Sutras, there is a beautiful sutra. Yoga Sutra says, Tivra Samveganam Asanaha. If he says, if you have that intense Samvega, intensity in you, what you can call as liberation or freedom or moksha or nirvana or mukti or kaivalya or whatever name you give, he says it is in front of you. It is there right in front of you. If you have that intensity, Tivra Samvega. That is basically what it means by samadhana. Bringing all faculties together to explore to question, to examine, to observe. And in this process of observation, it is the I which goes on creating the trouble. And therefore, in order to prevent the I from doing it, the first qualification is Shama, tranquility of mind, an undisturbed state of mind. That is the first qualification that is required. And progressively other qualifications have to be acquired. And finally, you have to come to this Samadhana, which is bringing together all your being. You want with all your life, everything that is you and me, we want, if you are serious, if your desire is to know that, that is Samadhana. I am only using these terms. Please don't give too much of importance when I'm saying mind or desire or sankalpa or whatever it is. These are only indicators to tell you about the seriousness which is, bubbling up with you, coming up in you. A serious feeling, a serious sense of being one, and you want to know. Nothing else matters to you. That is the single pointedness of the entire chitta. They did not say manasya ekagrata. They did not say the one pointedness of the manas. Very beautiful, very purposefully, the author said chitta, chittasya ekagrata, the ekagrata of the chitta. It should be so focused. Agra means the tip of a blade of grass. The tip of a blade of grass is called kushagra. Kusha means a darbha or a blade of grass. Agra means that point. How sharp is that point? So sharp should be our faculties and our intensity, so that it can pierce through this veil of ignorance and come to that reality. These are the 6 most important qualifications which have to be understood at a much deeper level in order to become eligible for the pursuit of mumuksha, to become a mumukshu. That's what is important. Sorry, I had to switch on the charger for the laptop. So here we have completed the 6 qualifications. I'll stop here and we will go to mumukshutvam in the next session. So I see some chat. I'll first stop sharing this screen and I'll come back to normal view, and I'll just see the, yes, Shraddhavan Labhate Jnanam is a very beautiful quote from the Bhagavad Gita. Only a Shraddhavan, one who has Shraddha, becomes, and my humble request is, don't translate these words into English or any other language in your mind and try to understand. Please hold on to the original words: Shama, Dama, Uparati, Titiksha, Shraddha, Samadhana. We have had enough of long explanations and discussions in English. But if you hold on to these English words, the soul will not be there. The body will be there, but the soul of that meaning will not be conveyed. So you please use these terms as it is. Shraddha. So initial stages, Shraddha is very important and fundamental for a disciple to progress in spiritual path. See, as I said, I gave you that example. See, a primary school teacher is important initially. A middle school teacher is important in the middle school. A high school teacher is important in the high school. A professor in the university is important at that level. So the guru has to expand and the disciple also has to expand in his understanding. But if you hold on to a physical guru, neither he will develop nor you will develop. Don't give too much of credence or too much of importance to this term guru. Why do you go on need an external support for every damn thing? Because we are lazy. We depend on others, especially from the psychological point of view, from the mental point of view, and then extrapolate it to the spiritual point of view also, because we are lazy by nature. I want something easy, something just like that. And this idiot called Krishnapani also becomes important to you now. You see, this fellow is not important at all. Don't give importance to the fellow who is talking. He's only speaking from out of his own ignorance, which may be less or more than others. But I am also on the same path. We are also in the same this thing, searching for each other. We are all searching for that ultimate reality in our own way. It's only we all come together so that we can exchange ideas. These are all not mine also. See, my understanding is not my purely coming from me, from the literature, from the books, from the references, from the talks of so many people, from my, see, it could be a culmination of my understanding, but I do not become important in this process. Hold on to the original and go about with it. Definitely, as I said, don't call every guide as a guru. If you have gone to a strange place, new place, the local tourist guide is important, but the tourist guide, you can't make him your guru. So don't give too much of importance to this guru aspect of it. That's where we have been misled. That's where we have been misled. See, this business is the most lucrative business. This guruship. You take anybody from any religion, any background, anywhere. They are filthy rich. They have huge estates. They have huge properties, huge interests, huge businesses. And unfortunately, we fall a prey to them, thinking that he is going to give us something. Whatever he is going to give will be only worldly. Okay. So please type your questions, if any, in chat. COVID seems to have made everyone examine the purpose. Yeah. But see, now we have come to know, Janaki Ramji, we have come to know that the so-called normal is no longer normal. What was normal in January, February, there has been a huge upheaval. Huge upheaval. So it's no longer the normal. So it is making people think, what was I doing earlier? What was I running after earlier? Is it really necessary? See, at least in this COVID period, I have lost personally about 4 or 5 people in my life. My own brother, a very close family friend, a lady doctor, and today another old gentleman, a very nice Parsi gentleman, with whom I have known him for more than half a century. Since my childhood, because he was my father's friend, though he was much younger to my father, but he was my father's friend. And I lost him this morning. And you know the position? Only his one nephew is there, that's all. Nobody is there. Nobody. Nobody means nobody. They called the driver who was helping him. That driver has come. For 2 reasons. One is because of the eclipse. All his friends said, we will come after 2 o'clock. He is with the body for the past 8 hours or so, 10 hours now. The gentleman passed away in his sleep. Nobody to help. And when I asked him, I also said I have got a program and then I can't come before 2, or I can't, even after 2 I have some things related to this eclipse and other things to do and some cooking to be done. So you see, this has made so many things what could be the reality of life. That there may be nobody to help you when you and I, when say somebody dies, there may be nobody to help us. Anyway, for the dead body, he doesn't require anything. The dead body itself doesn't require anything. It's only for our own, because of our own association of our relationship or whatever it is, we perform the last rites and all, but the dead body by itself doesn't need anything. So it has really made us think about the world. The world view has changed. The world view has to be changed. We have to change the world view from the I, me, going on saying me, I, me, mine, I, me, mine. We have to change this world view. This is the message of the Aitareya Upanishad. When time permits, there is a beautiful this thing which we have to examine from the modern point of view what the Aitareya Upanishad says. I'll not go into that because that will be a separate discussion. Abhipriya Singh, sir, law of karma really confuses me. In India, a large percentage of people are below poverty line. Is there suffering because of their karma? In contrast, in developed where the standard of living, had they all done good karma. See, don't look at it from purely physical point of view. Purely physical point of view, somebody is in poverty and somebody is in affluence, is a very, very, very narrow view. Abhipriya, please remember that it's a very narrow view and most of the poverty in this world is man-made. It is a part of karma, right? But we are also contributing to that nonsense. We are also contributing to that because we are unwilling to share what we have. We are unwilling to share what we have. I am sure there will be at least 50% of the physical things in one's own home which are of no use to us. But do we give them away? No. We don't give. So poverty is man-made and we are adding to each other's dushkarma, each other's bad karma, we are adding to it. While a person being born in a particular community, in a particular economic condition may be a factor of karma, but that's not a permanent thing. Karma is not a permanent aspect. Karma is changing on a day-to-day basis. Somebody who might have been very poor in his, at the time of his birth might have become a millionaire now. We have several examples of that. So that also is karma. Somebody who is very, very affluent has become very indigent or poor. That also is karma. So it is not a question of good or bad karmas and it's not a question of narrowly looking at it from the point of view of physical facilities. What is primarily required is, as we say, roti kapda makan. That is something that each one of is responsible to ensure to people around us. People around us should have food. People around us should have clothing. People around us should have shelter. But I can't go on giving food and shelter on a day and clothes on a daily basis and the other fellow doesn't do anything. That's not going to help. I provide food to somebody so that his body becomes enabled to do work. But he can't depend upon me on a daily basis to give him food and say, because I am poor, I don't have food and I don't want to do anything and therefore it is your duty to feed me. No. I have been objecting to this. I have seen two places. I don't want to name them because when I name them, there may be controversy. I don't want to name them. There are two places in Hyderabad where I have seen that hundreds of people will be lying idle and sleeping on the footpaths just for the clock to ring 12 o'clock when that particular place provides for food. One is a temple, the other is a mutt. They provide food daily. And there are hundreds of fellows who don't do anything in their life except sleep on the footpath or in some under some tree in a park, come exactly at 12 o'clock, eat that food and go back and sleep. Are we doing good service? Does anybody teach them that it is not meant to just eat and sleep? Why can't you do some cleaning? Why can't you do some gardening? Why can't you make them? Some of these mutts have huge estates and properties and there are big gardens. Why can't you ask them to do gardening? No, he won't do. Next time he'll say, oh, these fellows are forcing me to do some gardening. I'll go to another mutt or another temple or another place where some kind-hearted man will go on feeding me. So as a matter of culture, we have to overcome this. You can't blame everything on karma. As a matter of culture, as a matter of civilization. See, why is it that we don't find that in the Sikh community? Do you find a beggar in the Sikh community? And do you see that everybody does kar seva in the Gurdwara? However rich or however poor he may be, starting from polishing your shoes to cleaning the floor. And have you seen how spick and span these Gurdwaras are? I feel so happy, and the food is excellent. What do we do in the temples? You throw everything around the temple. Nobody cleans it. Do you call this as Hinduism? This is Sanatana Dharma. This is what your religion has taught you. Everybody is pushing and shoving each other, falling on each other. And somebody sits there and starts breaking the coconut and scatters all those sharp pieces of the coconut shell, which could injure so many people. What is this kind of culture and what is this kind of civilization we are talking about and blaming everything on karma? Unless some corona comes in, we don't want to be clean. We don't practice hygiene. We don't practice being at home comfortably, happily, going out only when required. We don't do any of these things. We ape the West. We want the Western food, Western restaurants, Western dress, Western culture, Western songs, Western music, and say that the whole damn thing is going to dogs. Have we understood ourselves in the first place? So poverty, see, I know several people who are poor by choice, doing excellent work. Very recently, I met one gentleman called Uma Shankarji. He's called as the Sun Yogi also. He was telling me that I have only one pair of clothes, one dhoti and one angavastram. When these are damaged, somebody gives me new ones. I wear them and throw them. I don't even keep a second pair. I don't even use. I was not using slippers or footwear, but I am forced to use in this corona because I am traveling by air, and they said without footwear you can't fly. So you can be poor without being wallowing in poverty. You can be poor by choice. And what did Ramana Maharshi wear throughout his life from the 18th year till the 78th year? For 60 years, what was he wearing? You call him poor? Is he not the richest man in the world? So you see, we have to get rid of this notion, get rid of this wrong interpretation of karma. Yes, blessed are the poor. Jesus in Sermon on the Mount. Yes, this is very, very true. See, sannyasa dharma is talked about in the Bhagavad Gita. There also the same thing is said. You need to have only that much to keep your body and soul together. In the sense, you are to keep the body alive. Rest of it is all accretion only. Rest of it is all accruing things and acquiring things. See, comfort is a state of mind. Comfort is not something external. Comfort is a state of mind. That is where one has to be comfortable. That is where one has to be at peace with oneself. So then you are happy whether you are in a palace or you are happy when you are in a poor man's hut. You are wherever you are happy. So that is that. See, all these qualifications indicate that pairs of opposites, wealth and poverty, is one pair of opposite we try to compare. Can we practice it from today? Giving up things, giving away things which we don't use, giving away things which we don't want. We have been storing and storing and storing for generations. Obviously they're all physical objects only. When you throw away things, the mind also gets uncluttered. When your surroundings are simple, when your surroundings are very ordinary, your mind also is uncluttered. So uncluttering the mind is the most important thing. Unless you unclutter it and unbundle this mind, which is the source of this identification, it will not help you. It is not. We are not truly on the spiritual path. It can see the unfortunately, even spirituality has become elitist. Only people who are otherwise comfortable, well off, have a good flat, good apartment, good source of income or pension or have settled themselves very well. Everything can be unsettled in a matter of seconds. Everything can become unsettled in a matter of seconds. We may be thinking that we are well settled. I have been giving this example. See, the earthquake which came in 2001 on 26th of January in Bhuj in Gujarat was a real eye-opener for me, and I have been quoting this example to everybody wherever I go. See, there were people who were fabulously rich who had enough money for the next 7 generations. And a few seconds of earthquake in the middle of the night has taken away everything from them. And the tragedy was that in a family of say 20 or 30 people, a 4-year child is alive and everybody is dead. In another family, a 75-year-old gentleman is alive and all the other family members are dead. And in certain cases, the wealth and gold and ornaments and jewelry and whatnot and diamonds and all which they were storing at home, they have gone so deep into the earth that you have to spend more than what they are worth to dig out and bring them out. Now, is it the law of probability says that such a thing can happen anywhere to anybody? So where is the question of being well settled, well furnished, well happy and all that? Anything, next moment, anything can happen. Are we prepared? Mentally, are we prepared to lose everything and start life afresh during this lifetime? If by misfortune or good fortune, if I alone live and everybody around me dies, can I start life afresh is a beautiful question, because it's happening in Corona. A father and son both died of Corona and they did not give the body. Very close to my place, about 1.5 kilometers away from my place. They are businessmen. They don't know where they have contracted this coronavirus. Both died. And the family members were not, the bodies were not given to the family members. They simply cremated them. They're not even giving ashes. So, Janaki Ramji's question becomes very pertinent in this time. Has it brought about any transformation in our mind? Has it brought about any realization that this could be the truth? This could be the reality around us? Yeah. So I may go on like this. I don't want to go into it, but you have to look at life very clearly. You please use the opportunity to learn more on karma from Jainism and Buddhism. Yes, Jainas and The Jaina philosophy and Buddhist philosophy also uses this term karma, but their context is slightly different. That's a subject by itself. It's a fascinating subject. Buddhism and Jainism are wonderful, they unclutter and they have simplified so many things. See, ultimately, it is not the explanation or the philosophy, it is the reality which matters. Whatever ism we are talking about, it is the reality which matters. So, thank you so much. I hope there are no more questions.
So,